Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on Iraq on the Brink. I'm JINSA's Vice President for Policy, Blaise Mishtal, and I'm pleased to be joined by really three experts who have spent a long time working on and studying Iraq, and I think are really well suited to provide us insights on the violence that happened in Iraq just over a week ago, between, on the one hand, supporters of Muqtada al-Sadr, and on the other, I guess it's a question of who, Iraqi security forces, Iranian-backed militias, in a violent clash that led scores of people dead. I think Iraq's political future up for grabs, and I think we're still trying to sort through what exactly that violence means. And so I'm delighted to have with us, I'll go in alphabetical order, JINSA Senior Fellow and former National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney, John Hanna, Ken Pollock, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, started his career at the CIA and served 2 tours on the National Security Council, and Joel Rayburn from the New America Foundation, an Army officer who I don't know, Joel, is it fair to call you the mastermind of the magnum opus, the U.S. Army in the Iraq War, a great history of the military's experience there over the last 2 decades, as well as more recently under the Trump administration, the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria and the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Lebanon Affairs. So John, Ken, Joel, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I wanted to take today's discussion maybe in somewhat chronological and hopefully logical order, and start with trying to understand how we got to the events of August 29th, figure out what actually happened in those 24 to 48 hours, and then talk about where Iraq goes from here and what the options and implications for the United States might be. And then I'll open it up to the audience for their questions, which they can submit using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and then I'll read them out to our panelists. But I guess let me start with maybe trying to better understand one of the main protagonists in the story, Muqtada al-Sadr, who's, I guess, been a mainstay of Iraqi politics over the last 20 years. I've heard him variously described as contributing to the violence and killing of American soldiers during the U.S. military's time there, as an Iraqi nationalist, as a strong champion against corruption in the Iraqi state, as someone pushing against the Iranian influence in Iraq. So it'd be great to get some both biographical and ideological detail on who exactly is Muqtada Sadr. What is he after? I don't know, Ken, maybe we can start with your views.
Sure. I'm glad to start things off. Joel also can add some great details from his own work on the Shia. Muqtada Sadr is the scion of one of Iraq's great Shia families. Without going too much into his pedigree, his father was a leading figure among the Shia during the period of Saddam's reign. He was mostly seen as collaborating with Saddam, but was eventually killed by Saddam's reign, along with Muqtada's 2 older brothers. When the U.S. invaded, Muqtada staked a claim to his father's constituency and tried to use his standing with those people to transform himself into a power broker in Iraq. Always very hard to get a read on exactly what he was trying to do. I have always suspected that what he was looking to do was to make himself kind of a Rahbar figure, an Iranian supreme leader type figure, even though he formally opposes the Iranian system of Velayat Faqih, right? But not necessarily running politics, but being this great figure standing above it. Muqtada, though, he's been a very, very problematic leader for Iraq, as so many other Iraqi leaders have. He makes lots of mistakes, right? Lots of them. And any Iraqi who knows him reasonably well, sometimes they will tell you that they think he is not playing with a full deck, or just not very bright, or deeply ignorant, but he makes lots of different mistakes all throughout his period of time. And you read through a very nice list, Blaze, of all of his different incarnations, right? All of those appellations attached to him, they're all correct. At different points in time, he has been all of those different things. He has, in some ways, a very close relationship to Iran, and in other ways, a very problematic relationship. He is simultaneously an Iraqi nationalist and someone who does ultimately tie his fortunes from time to time to the Iranians. He has been a voice arguing for reform and against corruption, but he has also been a source of tremendous corruption inside the Iraqi system. And in some ways, and I'll leave things off here for Joel and John to add additional points because there's lots to talk about. But I will simply end by saying that I think that it speaks volumes to just how bad the situation in Iraq has gotten, that the US government and so many other governments were looking to Muqtada al-Sadr after Iraq's October 2021 elections as being the voice of Iraqi nationalism and reform. When Muqtada al-Sadr is going to be carrying those banners on behalf of Iraqis and the US government, you know that you've reached a pretty low point.
Thanks, Ken. Joel, I'd be curious to get your thoughts on al-Sadr, particularly since, as Ken said, he contains multitudes, or he's been chameleon-like. Sort of what is his latest incarnation?
Okay, so yeah, Muqtada al-Sadr has been problematic from time to time, but I would say, Ken, you go to war with the reformers you have. Okay, a little more. So my thoughts on the background, where this and why why he's able to mobilize so many people so quickly, so effectively, and why he's such a force. Sort of, I don't know. It's like a T-wall sitting in the middle of the road of Iraqi politics. Being a Sadr in Shia Iraq is like being a Kennedy in Massachusetts. Whoever it is that has the name, regardless of their other qualifications, they're going to be the senator from Massachusetts if they want to be. And that's just he's going to be around. He's got the name. There's no challenger, and that massive Shia constituency that his father and his uncle first mobilized back in the 80s, late 70s to early mid 80s, is just with him. They're with the Sadr family. I would say he's a nationalist, yes. He's not an Iraqi nationalist. He's an Iraqi Shia nationalist. It's different. To be an Iraqi Shia nationalist, and that's not necessarily, it's not a religious thing. It's not an ideological thing necessarily. It's more of a sense that the South, that the Iraqi South, the people, the cities, the parties of the Iraqi South should be running Iraq, as opposed to the Iraqi West or the Iraqi North or the Iraqi Northeast. That it's the idea that it's sort of driven by the idea and have a bit of a chip on the shoulder to say, there are 15 million of us, or actually many more than that now. We're more than half the country. There's probably 20 million by now in the South and in the Shia areas of Baghdad, which is most of Baghdad. So there's the idea that we're the majority. We've been shut out. We are sitting on all the country's resources. We should be running this joint. And there's a mobilization of those communities along those lines. I'd say more specifically, I think he would like to be the leader of Najaf. He would like to be the leader of the, even if it's just de facto, of the Shia religious establishment. He would like to restore the traditional supremacy of Najaf over Qum in the global Shia community. And I think, as I mentioned, it's not just that it's a Southern thing for him. I think he would like to see his family's traditional constituency. So the movement of several million people and families that are with the Sadr movement forever, diehard. He would like to see those people basically running the Iraqi state, running Iraqi communities, running the Iraqi. He would like to see them in positions of power in the parliament, in local communities, in the police, and so on. And these people are they're the descendants of Iraq's urban and rural, southern rural Shia poor. And a lot of them aren't poor anymore in the new Iraq, but that's where they come from. These have been working class people, agricultural class people, sort of, the underprivileged in Iraq. And he would like to see them in the ascendancy. At the same time, though, I think he doesn't want to alienate the rest of Iraq. He'd like them to be in sort of a reordered Iraq with the South in the ascendancy, which it kind of is now. But then he would like to connect that Iraq, which is led by the South. He would like to plug it into the rest of the Arab world, including Saudi Arabia, so that it has normal and productive relations of all kinds, especially commercial relations with the rest of the world. And as he's doing all this, he's been playing something of a long game because he's a young man still, relatively. He's younger than me. And so I think, okay, that's not so young anymore. But he's positioning for a post-Sistani order in Shia Iraq. And he's also positioning for a post-Khamenei order in the broader Shia sphere. Along the way, we can get into this in a little more detail because it has to do with what happened last week. He would like to eliminate the splinter movements, the splinters from the Sadr movement, so that they're not challengers in this jockeying for position. That's Qais Ghazali and others. And he would like to, I think, outlast, if not eliminate, the Dawa party, especially Maliki's portion of the Dawa party, so that they're not a challenger to ascendancy inside the Shia sphere in the future. Okay, I wanted to stop there because I would like to hear what John has to say. Then we can talk more about, get into more of those, because each one of those currents kind of fed into last week and also where it's probably going.
Great. Thanks, Joel. So yeah, John, eager to get your thoughts on sort of the true face of Muqtada al-Sadr, but also maybe, if you could sort of catch us up to the events or the political landscape that led us up to, sort of was it the morning of August 29th last week, where the Green Zone was occupied by thousands, tens of thousands of Sadr's supporters. And Sadr, didn't have any seats in parliament or in the government, despite the fact that his party won the most seats out of any party in the October parliamentary election. So how did we get to where we were last week?
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Blaise, and thanks to Ken and Joel for joining this. I'm not sure. I mean, there's no doubt lots more to add about Sadr. I think I agree entirely with Ken. He's just a walking contradiction. He was obviously the leading nemesis of the United States in the first several years after our invasion of Iraq. No doubt his Mahdi army, his militia, responsible for killing lots and lots of American soldiers. His Mahdi army, his militia were the leading edge when Iraq went into some of the darkest days, the abyss of its civil war period in around 2006. It was a lot of his guys together with other Shiite militias that were absolutely terrorizing Sunnis in particular, neighborhoods in and around Baghdad and other parts of Iraq. But as the world turns and fast forward to where we are now, it's quite, having been an official in those days when there was very active discussions and debates within the United States government on the merits of actually taking out Muqtada Sadr, doing to him what Trump did to Soleimani in early January of 2020. Removing him from the playing field and then dealing with what would no doubt have been the aftershocks of that which is millions of disaffected, disenfranchised, angry young Shiite men, primarily out of Sadr city, but no doubt other parts of southern Iraq, taking to the streets and adding their voices and weapons and arms to what was already a brewing and serious Sunni insurgency led by the remnants of the Ba'ath Party. A decision was made not to do that, and now here we sit in 2022, and Sadr is, as Ken said, for a lot of people, might be our only way out of the failing and collapsing post 2003 Iraq project. I just add to, what Joel said. There are an awful lot of Shiites that think Shiites ought to dominate this thing, who are Shiite nationalists. Some have closer ties to the Iran, some have fewer ties. They all believe they ought to dominate. Most of them come from Baghdad and the South. The interesting thing about Sadr after the October 2021 elections, when he won 73 out of Parliament's 329 seats, was the dominant party, was his decision that he was done with the pro-Iranian Shiite militias and the parties that they were affiliated with, that he was going to ally not with the remainder of the Shiite house, but he was actually going to try and move beyond sectarian politics and have a coalition with both the leading Sunni party in Iraq and the largest vote getter among the Kurdish parties in Iraq. Let's remember, a very strong American ally, the KDP up in Erbil, and one that's fairly well known to have significant informal ties with Israel. But that was the coalition Sadr wanted to make. He thought he could get to a majority and have a cross-sectarian majority government that would have very much marginalized Iran and its main allies inside of Iraq and thrown them into opposition, which is where their actual votes in the election of October 2021 should have put them, in the opposition. And the people who got the most votes ought to have been allowed to form a majority government and lead a democratic government, with everybody else being in a loyal opposition mode. This being Iraq, that was intolerable to Iran and the pro-Iranian parties and militias. They went through a lot of shenanigans, including, a lot of people believe, using the Iraqi court system to basically frustrate Sadr's efforts to form a government at every turn, raising the threshold of how many votes, what kind of supermajority you would require in parliament in order to move forward with the constitutional election of a president, and then the naming of a prime minister and approval of his government through the courts. They frustrated that process. Sadr in June of 2022 decided he was going to pick up his marbles and walk out. I think it was one of the great mistakes that Ken has referred to, where he told and ordered all 73 of his members of parliament, the largest party in parliament, resign your seats. I think he thought he could somehow shock the system into coming around and making concessions to him. Instead, people followed the rules that were in existence, and all of Sadr's seats went to the runner-up to the Sadr, who had come runner-up to Sadr in October 2021, and a lot of them happened to be the pro-Iranian parties. So he dramatically strengthened his enemies within the parliament, who then immediately made the decision they were going to rush and try and name their own prime minister and form a government, at which point Sadr began a multi-month effort to shut down the Iraqi system by having his supporters peacefully, but quite aggressively invade the Green Zone, take over parliament, stop parliament from functioning. They made a similar effort with the Supreme Judicial Court in Iraq, tried to pressure it to dissolve parliament, demand a new election. It's not quite clear what Sadr's game plan was, but it all led up to last week, where there was growing frustration, growing tension, no government after more than 10 months, at which point Sadr was making all kinds of threats. I personally think he is edging up to trying to figure out through some mechanism, whether you call it a revolution, a coup, or whatnot, how he could somehow collapse and overturn the post-2003 system and create some kind of new system that gets rid of all of the old elite. Whether that includes Sadr himself or not, I doubt it. I assume he wants the kind of role that Ken's described as the kingmaker behind the scenes for the entire system going forward, a Sadr-led system. But out of the blue, last Monday, I guess it was, or 2 Mondays ago, this gets complicated, but an Iraqi cleric in Iran who was quite hardline, but he happened to be the cleric that Sadr's revered father, before his death, I guess, had basically said, upon my death, I advise all of the millions of people who follow me that this cleric in Qom in Iran, Khazem al-Hari, will be the person that my followers ought to try and emulate and follow for religious guidance, and which included, of course, his son, Muqtada. Well, lo and behold, this aging cleric last Monday, who had had tensions with the young Sadr over the course of the last 20 years, came out suddenly with a statement, which was quite unprecedented, in which he himself said, I'm getting out, I'm retiring, which almost never happens for any of these marjas, these sources of emulation in Shiite, in Shiism. He said, I'm getting out of the business, and I advise all of my followers that they ought to go follow the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. And he denounced the young Sadr, said essentially he was not the successor to his revered family, his father and the family, at which point a clear effort by Iran to remove all legitimate sanction and legitimacy from Sadr and his movement, at which point Sadr clearly had a problem because he himself doesn't have the kind of high-level religious credentials to be himself a source of emulation. And whether or not, I mean, it's hard for an American mind to imagine that, this is a very important thing in Shiism, is to actually have this kind of source of religious legitimacy and person that you follow and you emulate. But Sadr said, okay, I'm removing myself from politics. I'm withdrawing. I'm ending my political career, which I say parenthetically, he's done a number of times in the past, so I don't think anybody should believe him. But at which point, all of his followers in the Green Zone and other parts of Iraq just kind of went crazy, went on a rampage in the Green Zone. Again, not armed, but going after the Republican palace, the seat of parts of the Iraqi government, and creating really quite a chaotic scene. Attacking.
Thanks, John. Maybe I'll pause you there before we dissect what actually happened on the night and the following day. But I'd be curious on Ken and Joel's assessment. Did these tweets from Ayatollah Hari, is that really what prompted Sadr's sudden decision to say he's retiring from politics? And was that decision what prompted his supporters to begin this rampage? Was it directed by Sadr himself? Was it just a reaction, sort of unprovoked, undirected by him? How should we understand sort of what actually happened? Joel, do you want to share with your thoughts first?
So no, it wasn't accidental. None of this was accidental. The thing, and it wasn't the Hari statement. The Hari statement was essentially, I mean, you can read that as a press release from the Supreme Leader's office. So let's set that aside for a second. What what set all this off was that having abandoned the field in June, with the essentially what Muqtada was saying was, okay, wise guys, you're going to block my every move. Guess what? Over to you. Go ahead and try to form a government without me and my movement. Go ahead. Let's see you try. And the coordination framework, which is the other Shia, which is the Iran aligned Shia parties, over the course of 2 months and more, they actually did get their act together enough to coordinate enough to make a run at forming a government. And they were on the brink of nominating a prime minister and getting it pushed through, having sort of intimidated the rest of their opposition inside the parliament. That was about to happen. So so Nuri Maliki and Qais Khazali in particular were about to name a prime ministerial candidate, and that's when the Sadrists decided to act. I think obviously the IRGC Supreme Leader and the coordination framework guys saw this coming, and the Ha'ari thing was their attempt to try to preempt Muqtada and rob him of legitimacy as he was responding to their gambit of nominating a prime minister and trying to ram that prime minister through the parliament. I was really surprised at the tone deafness and lameness of the Iranian regime in dealing with the Iraqi scene, because Kazem al-Ha'ri was basically, if you think the Sadr movement, the leaders of the Sadr movement in the 80s and 90s, this was Muhammad Sadiq Sadr, Muqtada's father, ran basically a college in Najaf. He ran a houza. And so all of the different clerics that are now leaders of the various strands of the Sadr movement or the splinters from the Sadr movement were students or lecturers or associate professors of the Muhammad Sadiq Sadr Hausa. And Kazem al-Ha'ri was basically, he was like the vice dean, or the vice chancellor. If Muhammad Sadiq Sadr was like the chancellor of the college or the dean of the college, Kazem al-Ha'ri was the number two. And that's why he inherited kind of the leadership role as an Ayatollah. But he's been in Iran for decades. And he's a dried up old fossil now. He's 84. He hasn't been very active as a marja anyway. And the idea that was going to undermine Muqtada Sadr's legitimacy with the millions of young people that are following him, for whom, the world is a different place. The Shia world too is a different place for these people. And they're not necessarily looking to some PhD cleric in Qum or Tehran to answer all their questions. Muqtada is their de facto marja. Okay, he can't be de jure, he can't be outright, but they're following his guidance. And so I thought it was a really tone deaf move by the Supreme Leader. And then also to foist on Ha'ari to announce that he's retiring as a marjan, and no one does that. It's about as unprecedented as retiring as Pope, although that did happen recently. So that wasn't a cause. That was one of the Iranian regime's rejoinders, but it also illustrated that the Iranian regime, the way they operate, and no Iraqis are fooled by. The Iraqis say, okay, you're gonna take one of our ayatollahs from Najaf, and you're just gonna treat him like a ventriloquist dummy. Okay, we see what you're about. It was kind of a ham-handed move, the kind of thing that I never would have expected in the days of Qasem Soleimani, for example. He would have been much more savvy and not so blunt and obvious. I'll leave the rest to Ken.
Thanks, Joel. Ken, your assessment of sort of what kicked things off on August 29th?
Sure. Look, I actually think that John did a really nice job of laying everything out. And I think that Joel's comments are very much dovetailing with John. We don't see them as contradicting John at all, right? As Joel was kind of pointing out there at the end of his remarks, you had a much larger set of issues going on, which these specifics then became sparks to. As John pointed out, you had a situation where Muqtada Sadr won the 2010 election. Sorry, really dating myself, the 2021 election. But he was unable to form a government, as John described, a majoritarian government, a government consisting of his group of mostly, if we can use the term, moderate Shia, along with Masoud Barzani's Kurds and most of the Sunnis, right, which would have been revolutionary for post-2010 Iraq, and was seen as a tremendous threat by, as Joel pointed out, the coordinating framework, this group of mostly Iranian-backed Shia groups, right, who are going to be excluded from power. And almost certainly the Iranians as well saw this as a threat. They were sandbagging Sadr every way they possibly could, including by using their control over the courts. In particular, Nouri al-Maliki has tremendous influence with the judiciary, and so they were using that to do that. As John described, Sadr got frustrated, right? He got incredibly frustrated that the system was not working the way that it was supposed to. He did, as Joel said, decide, all right, you think you can form a government without me? Ahlan wa sahlan, give it a try, right? And the danger was that he foolishly told all of his people to resign, as John and I both pointed out, right? And stupidly, without understanding what that meant, it allowed his adversaries to go ahead and do this, right? But as Joel is also pointing out, it was clear that Sadr was never going to accept this, right? And those of us who follow Iraq closely, we could see it all bubbling up to the surface, how frustrated and angry Muqtada was that this was moving in this direction. The Iranians had to act. All right. Two, I think, bigger points that are worth thinking about right now at this moment in time. The first one purely about Iraq, which is, again, just how broken this system has become. Right? To some extent, Muqtada shouldn't have won the election in 2021. He did so because the Iraqis moved to a new electoral system, and Muqtada's people figured out how to use that electoral system that allowed him to gain the most votes, the most seats in the parliament. But when you actually look at the numbers of votes cast, far more people actually voted for the Iranian-backed parties, right? Which is equally troubling in a whole variety of different ways. But so Muqtada was able to steal a march and then was unable to form a government because his adversaries used these same old completely extra-legal, extracurricular methods to sandbag him, right? Including, once again, going back to the courts, getting a new ruling, as John was describing, that basically made it impossible to elect a president, and you can't do anything in Iraq until you've elected a president there. You can't get a prime minister or a government. And this frustrated Sadr to the point where he decided to take his own extra-legal, extra-constitutional actions, right? And it's just illustrating how thoroughly broken this system is, and how we should not be expecting this system to heal itself, right? It is headed in a terrible direction, and the only question is really how fast it gets there. The other point is the point that Joel was raising, which I think is also important to understand, which is that while the Iranians have played an incredibly pernicious role in Iraq ever since certainly 2004, but arguably even before then, and they still continue to play that very detrimental role, this isn't all about Iran, right? I completely agree with Joel that Iran's ability to manipulate the Iraqi system has declined dramatically since the killing of Qasem Soleimani. Soleimani was brilliant, and he understood how to manipulate the Iraqi system in ways that we simply haven't seen his successors, been able to do so, right? Far more of this process, of the events that John and Joel have laid out, have been driven by Iraqis themselves. And it's clear the Iranians are playing a supporting role. They're trying, they're encouraging, they're doing all these things. But at the end of the day, so much of this mayhem is simply being caused by the Iraqis themselves. In fact, I think, I'll go out on a limb here, but I feel comfortable in saying that I actually don't think we would have these problems if Qasem Soleimani were alive. We'd have a different set of problems, but we wouldn't have these problems. In many ways, these are created by the fact that the Iranians can't push the system the way that they wanted to when he was alive. It's being left to the Iraqis, and the Iraqis don't have the capability to do any better, despite the fact, we should point out, that we've actually got a pretty good Iraqi president in Barham Saleh and a pretty good Iraqi prime minister in Mustafa al-Kadhimi.
So Ken, just to be clear on what you're arguing, sort of the various attempts that we've seen to disrupt the government formation process since the October election, the Supreme Court ruling that was mentioned, there's the assassination attempt on Prime Minister Khatami. You think all of that is more sort of instigated and planned by Shiite factions within Iraq rather than directed from Tehran necessarily?
Yeah, I mean, I have no doubt that that Maliki is from time to time going and checking with the Iranians before he does some things, but I know Maliki reasonably well, and I've known him for quite some time, and he doesn't like the Iranians, first of all. And when he was prime minister, he actually shut the Iranians out far more than people recognized he did. And even today, he'll use the Iranians as much as he can, and he will do what he has to do to keep them on his right side, because he does understand that he is beholden to them. But he often does lots of things entirely of his own volition. This is a man with a lot of initiative, and rarely for the good. But we need to recognize that Joel Ray's Qais Ghazali, Hadi Al-Amri is out there. All of these guys are free agents, right? And yes, they have relationships with Iran, but they are not necessarily cat's paws of Iran. There are Iraqis who are cat's paws of Iran. They're not necessarily the ones who've really been driving this process.
Thanks, Ken. So John, back to you, and sort of wanted to ask you to fill us in on what exactly happened once things got ugly on the night of August 29th. But also, it seems like what happened last week was, as we've been talking about here, principally intra-Shiite schism or an intra-Shiite strife in Iraq, which, I guess the question would be, how striking is that, given that sort of past political turmoil that we've seen in 2006 and in the Maliki era leading up to 2014 all seem to be more sectarian, Sunnis versus Shiites. Is this really the first major intra-Shiite split we've seen, and how significant is that?
Well, anyway, the short story of what happened is that the unarmed solderists who had been occupying the green zone for several months, particularly outside of the parliament, once Sadr withdrew himself from politics after the Al-Hari fatwa against the Sadrists, decided to go out and start going after other government institutions, going after the coordinating framework protesters who were conducting their own sit-in around the green zone. And lo and behold, they eventually, and it's very unclear. My guess is, and I think most of the reporting suggests that the Iraqi government had issued whatever it's worth in order to the official Iraqi security forces, essentially to stand down and not do anything. And they've been doing that for months, allowing Sadrists to roam free and shut down parliament and threaten the Supreme Court, and now take over the Republican Palace on October 29th. And that it really was elements of the Shiite militias, whether it was Qais Ghazali's group, Asab al-Haq, or other elements associated with Maliki that began the process of defending their positions in the green zone, firing on these unarmed protesters, killing, we don't know, 15, 30, 60, 100 of them. I'm not sure we've got an accurate count of how many died, at which point these unprepared Sadrists, somebody within Sadr's own forces and militias, armed groups, began calling in their armed reinforcements sometime on Monday evening, and they brought lots of stuff to the party in terms of mortars and rockets and weapons, and they began firing fairly chaotically, and it really turned that whole green zone area and probably other parts of Iraq that we don't get reporting on into battlefields. And it was only the next day, I think around 1 p.m. Iraqi time, where for whatever reason, and again, we don't have clear fidelity on why Sadr suddenly, after allowing this violence, unrestrained violence and pandemonium and warfare to go on in the seat of Baghdad, the seat of the Iraqi government in Baghdad for 24 hours, got up and in a short press conference condemned a lot of his followers for engaging in violence, telling them if they didn't withdraw within an hour, he was going to withdraw any support for them. And lo and behold, which is another thing you have to actually stop and think about, a country where, again, he's a crazy guy. Whether he's medically crazy or insane, I don't know. But he's very, very mercurial and erratic and has made so many mistakes, as Ken said, but he can snap his fingers, give a few-minute press conference, tell his thousands of followers to withdraw from a place in 60 minutes where they've been camped out for months, and it immediately happens. The violence ends, and suddenly we have this, more or less, this period of calm in and around Baghdad, a temporary one, no doubt, but it does go to show you that you're dealing with a country where this kind of thing, a single leader, erratic leader who nobody knows from 1 hour to the next what it is he's going to order or do, can get tens of thousands, if not millions of people to follow his commands, no matter how many mistakes he makes. So it's for me, it's just a further indication of how unbelievably difficult and dire this situation is that we face in trying to create a more decent, representative type of government inside of Iraq going forward. As far as the other parties in Iraq, they've mostly been sitting on the sidelines, I think, watching some degree of horror this show. On the other hand, you're kind of like Henry Kissinger during the Iran-Iraq War. Can both of these guys kind of lose to some extent? You wish, even though that's not fair. You don't want to see this bloodshed occur. But there have always been these tensions in the Shiite house, I think. I mean, like Ken says, these are very strong personalities, parties with identities, rivalries that have gone on for a very long time. I think in the crucible of the immediate post-war years, maybe for a decade or so, these groups hung together because, in some part, because of Sistani's role, the Grand Ayatollah and Najaf, who wanted to keep Shiites together, insisted on it, that they be able to be the majority in Iraq and show that they could govern in a kind of rational and decent and effective way, until he dropped out as well because he became so frustrated with this political elite. So those tensions have always existed in the background, and as time has gone on, they've gotten more and more into the open, as Ken and I think Joel said. Maliki and Sadr actually came to blows during Maliki's time as prime minister, where with the backing of US forces, he essentially pushed the Sadrists, the Mahdi army, kind of crushed it for a period of time that Sadr has never forgiven him for. But yes, I would say this election cycle is the first time that we've really seen these splits emerge into the open, and Sadr deciding as a conscious matter that the best thing for Iraq is to break the Shiite house, to split it, and to form this majoritarian type of government going forward that really does marginalize these pro-Iranian militias and parties.
Thanks, John. Ken, any insights into what made Sadr stand down? One of the things I've read is it was a call from Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Is Is there any credibility to those claims?
So yeah, this is a big issue within the Iraq, among Iraqis and among Iraq watchers, exactly what happened there. I think the evidence is actually quite good that Nasrallah was not the catalyst in this, that in point of fact, Nasrallah and other Iranian agents did try to intercede, and Muqtada wasn't interested, just wasn't listening to any of them, wouldn't even take the calls. Nevertheless, the Iranians are putting it out that it was Nasrallah who made this all happen. I think that the evidence is much stronger that it was a combination of two things, really, which is first, Muqtada understanding that this was getting way out of hand and was not going to end in any kind of a good fashion for him. I want to go back to things that I've said, that John said, that Joel said. Where Muqtada was pushing this was toward an outright revolution. But it was absolutely unclear that Muqtada had actually made a conscious decision to do that, let alone that he was prepared to lead it and prepared for the consequences and the blowback, right? Muqtada is not Vladimir Lenin. He is not going to make the revolution at all costs. And whoever needs to die needs to die. This is a guy we've seen repeatedly. We all had some experience back in 2004 when he tried, down in Najaf and Karbala to grab power and quickly retreated when it became clear that that was going to become bloody. John just brought up 2008 when the same thing happened in Basra. Right? We've seen Muqtada do this repeatedly. He will make a grab at power, and then when he faces real resistance, he gets terrified, right? And quickly retreats away from it. I think that was part of what happened. The other thing that does seem to have happened, and again, I think that the evidence is still a little bit unclear. We don't quite know what happened, but I do think that it seems highly likely that Grand Ayatollah Sistani let it be known to Muqtada that he was not in favor of any of this, that it needed to stop, that he did not like the fighting that was going on among the Shia groups, that in particular, he did not like the fact that Muqtada was in effect using violence. And John was right, he kept trying to use nonviolence, right? It was nonviolent force. He was occupying things. He was daring other people to forcibly evict his people. He was in effect using force, and that this was the exact opposite of what Sistani wanted. And so Sistani let it be known in the ways that only the Shia clergy understand. He let it be known to Muqtada that he did not have Sistani's support, that Sistani opposed this, and that vote of no confidence from Sistani reinforced, I think, Muqtada's own sense that, yes, this was getting way out of hand, and he had unleashed a tiger, probably not meaning to do so. And once again, he walked away.
Joel, any further color or different assessment on what brought this to a close?
Yeah, there were a couple of things. I mean, first, I agree with Ken's assessment that he wasn't ready to carry this through to its logical conclusion, which would have been, an all-out revolt, and nor clear, if he would have won that, where it would have gone. It was pretty unpredictable. However, so he backed off. He does that all the time. That's what he sort of moved, and then he comes back a little bit. But in the last several years, I think he's almost always won something out of those encounters. And it looks to me like this clash last week resulted in him making the points that he felt he needed to make, and his team, let's say, Team Sauter, felt they needed to make. They demonstrated once again that they can put tens of thousands of people in the street, at least, in a way that none of the other parties can match ever. He demonstrated reach, geographical reach, because it was an intense clash, standoff, deadlock in the green zone, and maybe some other parts of Baghdad, look at what happened elsewhere. Outside of Baghdad, no contest. His guys went in and burned all of Qaisar Ghazali's offices everywhere in the south, to the degree that Qaisar Ghazali had to say, okay, we're closing down all our offices anyways. Now that they're all burned out shells. He burned some of Maliki's offices in the south. And I think he reminded everybody, I can put all these people in the street. They're loyal to me and my movement. Secondly, I can do it everywhere. I can do this anywhere at any time, and you can't match me, and you can't. So he reestablished that, and I think actually that probably will have stopped the Maliki Ghazali Hadi al-Amri gambit to appoint a prime minister of their own. Probably will have stopped it in its tracks, which is what he was intending to do. The way he did it, there were two things about how he did it that I find interesting. First is that he said, I don't know who instigated all this violence. Wow. I don't know who did it. However, I'm ordering into it within 60 minutes. I don't know who's controlling all these people out on the street. Who knows? It's a mystery to me, but I'm ordering them all. I'm ordering them all to retreat within an hour, which is, it's like saying, I can move. I can turn this on. I can turn this off. Don't forget it. Secondly, in his press conference, he did something which I found very interesting. He thanked the PMF, the Hashid, rank and file. In other words, some of the guys that were fighting his people. He thanked them for like their service and their professionalism throughout the difficult period. And he said, you guys are fine. I'm good with. He basically said, I'm good with you guys. I'm not, because you're not to blame for what your terrorist leaders are doing. And that's him putting, trying to drive a wedge between the foot soldiers and the Ghazali and Maliki and and the rest, Muhammad Ali and the rest, which I think also is a signal. It's another shot across the bow saying, if it comes to it, guys, let's see whether your rank and file will line up against me, or whether they are actually just my supporters in waiting. So that was another warning. I think maybe he calculates that he can rob the elite Shia parties of their rank and file constituency, whatever they have left. Lastly, I think Iraqis all across the country view the current political system as utterly illegitimate. The turnout in the last few elections has been in a nosedive. I think it was under 30% in the October 2021 election. Virtually no one is investing legitimacy in this system. So he doesn't lose by opposing it. He did. So I disagree a little bit with John and Ken that it was a mistake for him to say, you know what, I'm out of the whole system. Have your parliament, I'm out of it. Because I think he's looking all at the mood across Iraq and in the electorate, right? And they're sort of opting not to be an electorate. There's a broad rejection. So I think this is going to come back to another clash. It's like clashing and then separating and clashing and so they're in that right now. But it's not like the Iraq. It's not like the vast majority of Iraqis are kind of indignant at Sadr opposing that system. He doesn't lose credibility by doing that. I think he's lining up on the right side of history, I think, as President Obama might say.
So Joel, let me pause you there because I just realized that we have about 4 minutes left here. Unsurprisingly, this has been a complicated series of events to unravel. So maybe in sort of a 2-for-1 question that we can do quickly with all three of you is I'd want to ask who, if anybody, is the winner of this turmoil and sort of what the prospects are for where Iraq goes from here. Are we headed to more violence? Are we headed towards another civil conflict? Is this, or has this sort of now been hashed out, and a political process can proceed after all of this? Ken, you want to start?
Not particularly, Blaze.
Oh.
I'll be honest with you. I don't.
In 1 minute or less, Ken.
Yeah, in 1 minute, I don't think there is a winner in this. I think Muqtada mostly overplayed his hand. Joel, I think John and I are defining mistake in a slightly different way than you are. I don't disagree that Muqtada got some things out of this, but I don't think that this is ending at all how he wanted it to. I don't think it's quite ending the way that the Iranians or the Iranian-backed militias wanted it to, because I think you're right that they've also been cautioned by these events. And what I'll say is that I'm quite certain that Iraqi democracy has not prospered as a result of it, and what the United States wanted has not been advanced by it.
Joel, winners, losers, where we go next?
Well, tactically, I do think Sadr came out, having proved his point, for having reestablished his popular power as a tool in this Shia political struggle. But on the whole, I think this is a dying system, and that the path out of it isn't clear. Even if there's some government that is formed, it will be deeply unstable. The stable configuration would have been the one that Sadr tried to put together, that the Iranians showed themselves capable of walking, that the United States did virtually nothing to try to help them to form, which I think the lesson for me in all this is that what the hell were we, the United States, doing, not pulling out all the stops to enable Muqtada Sadr, of all people, to put together a coalition of the non-Iranian aligned major parties in Iraq. I don't know why. That was a strategic blunder, and now I don't think there's a way back to that. So I'm procedurally, maybe this will wind up going to, they'll have new elections or something like that, but it's not going to resolve. It's not going to resolve itself. And this is a system, as Ken said, that can't heal itself. So I really do. I think the system is kind of, in a death spiral.
Thanks, Joel. John, last words go to you.
Yeah, I agree with the dire assessment that I think Ken and Joel share, that there's no clear path out of this, and the system, I think, has reached a dead end, the post-2003 system. I remember I wrote an article in January of 2020 in which I think they gave it the title, Iraq Needs Regime Change, which is, I didn't really need that, but I do think it's absolutely right. But how you get from here to there with this kind of political elite and the amount of weapons that the Iranians have put on the street into these militias that can, yes, are failing at making things happen in a positive sense, and yet can block everything from moving forward. I think, unfortunately, and we've got a major Shiite religious pilgrimage underway right now in the first half of September. But I think once that's over, both of these parties, I don't think they've learned much of a lesson. I think, what people associate with Iraqi politics, the violence, the sense of strong men, strong leaders, Iraq is not big enough for Maliki and Khazali and Sadr all to be in that mosh pit together. And I think we're headed for a major showdown, for it to get even worse before it gets better. And then I think, the United States has got a terrible dilemma about how it plays whatever remaining cards it has left in Iraq, including simply protecting our forces as this maelstrom gets unleashed inside of Iraq. What do we do with our guys that are positioned there, supposedly training an Iraqi security force that is standing on the sidelines? unable to really affect the situation, much less pro-American Iraqi political leaders that sit in these palaces and have no power to decide anything. How do we protect our guys and the few friends that we really care about in Iraq in a deep way and have invested in, particularly our Kurdish friends in the north, and make sure that they don't get caught up too deeply in the violence and chaos that looks like it could be coming.
Well, Ken, Joel, John, thank you for that tour de force and attempt to shed light on an extremely complex and convoluted series of dynamics and events that have happened in Iraq, culminating in the violence last week. I hope your predictions for greater conflict and confrontation in Iraq aren't true. But I hope that if there do continue to be these convolutions, we can have you back to learn more about what's going on there. So thank you again for your time. Thanks to all of you who tuned in for watching, and have a good afternoon. Thank you.